Please take your seats. Good afternoon, everyone, and good afternoon to all those who have joined us online. So, friends, in the last class, we understood how the fiscal policy and the monetary policy has performed across the past 12 months and where the present fiscal space and monetary space is. Now, today we will start the class by understanding how the scenario of inflation has been in the past 12 months and why the budget projects what it projects, because inflation is a key macroeconomic indicator. It indicates about the health of any economy. Before we dive into this chapter, it is important for us to understand the relationship that exists between inflation on one hand, fiscal policy, monetary policy, and external sector on the other hand. Got it? So, inflation, that's what we will try to understand first in the class. How it impacts fiscal policy, how it impacts monetary policy, and how it impacts the external sector. Now look here. What is inflation, by the way? How do you define inflation? It's a scenario wherein there is a persistent rise in the general price levels, which generates a kind of feeling that this rise will continue. Inflation is always across the board. It means it involves all goods and all services, and it is not a one-time price rise, but it's a sustained kind of effect. Got it? Now, inflation can be mainly because of demand reasons or cost reasons. Do you understand that? But in India, I told you, most of the inflation is structural in nature, but we can include that in the category of cost push inflation. So I hope you are already aware about these two terms, which is demand pull inflation, and this is cost push inflation. Now, look here. When an economy is mostly consumption based, then this kind of inflation is more prevalent in that economy. Now, I'm not saying that an economy which is consumption based cannot face cost push inflation, but generally you would see that such an economy would suffer from demand pull inflation, and an economy which is mostly facing inflation due to the reasons on the demand side faces a lot of retail inflation. Now you understand, inflation can also be calculated at different levels, like at the level of producer, at the level of wholesaler, and at the level of retailer. Got it? Now, I hope all of you are aware about these two indices, the consumer price index and the wholesale price index. Headline inflation in India is measured with the help of what? CPI or WPI? Now, for a long period of time, India used to measure its headline inflation on the basis of WPI, but recently India has shifted to CPI combined. Got it? Because there is something called CPI rural, CPI urban, and CPI combined. So CPI combined is the indicator for measuring headline inflation in India. Do you understand that? Now, headline inflation is that term which is generally referred to, or that inflation is the inflation which is generally referred to when we talk about macroeconomic indicators, and we include inflation as one of such indicators. Got it? So, जब भी हम inflation की बात करते हैं, तो हम कौन से inflation की बात करते हैं? Mostly CPI combined, as far as India is concerned, because that's the headline inflation indicator in India. Now, look here. An economy which is cost push, which is facing cost push kind of inflation, is generally an economy which is investment based. Now look here, if you invest in the economy, it means there is capital expenditure. Now, will you not include the expenditure, capital expenditure cost also in the cost of production? So that will automatically increase the price of goods and services. Got it? So generally speaking, though you understand that we cannot make such kind of close-ended assumptions that a consumption-based economy will always face demand pull inflation, an investment based economy will always face cost push inflation. Now, we cannot make such generalization. What I'm saying is generally that has been the case. But you know, there could be something called counter cyclical monetary policy, and that can change the entire scenario. Got it? So I hope you are aware about this, right? So inflation is actually a scenario in the economy when there is a persistent rise in the prices of goods and services. What goods and services? All goods and all services. Though we can also study inflation sector wise, like say for example, inflation in the steel sector, inflation in the textile sector. We can also study inflation in that way. But generally speaking, inflation is across the board. It means it includes all goods and all services. Inflation is generally of two types, demand pull and cost push. You can also include a third type, which is structural inflation, but that is more or less related to the cost push factors. If an economy is consumption based mostly, then the inflation that it faces is demand pull. And what kind of inflation? Mostly retail inflation. Got it? ये चीज आप ध्यान में रखिए. When an economy is cost push economy, when an economy is investment based economy, the inflation that it faces mostly is cost push inflation, because every investment that you make into the economy adds up to your costs, and that's why the overall costs of goods and services enhances proportionately. Now let us try to understand how inflation impacts the fiscal policy, how it impacts monetary policy, and how it impacts the external sector. Let's talk about monetary policy first, because generally when we talk about inflation, we talk about monetary tightening or quantitative tightening or a tight monetary policy. Now generally it has been seen that one major reason for rise of inflation is because of increase in the money supply in the economy. Now, it is not necessary that inflation will be caused only when there would be an increase in the money supply. Money supply can remain constant, and yet there could be inflation if there are supply side problems. Do you understand that? It means, suppose the logistical network, it means the trade transport network, entire network has collapsed, suppose, for some reason. Think about COVID-19 pandemic, which almost caused the entire sector to come to a standstill. So if there are logistical reasons, then even if the money remains constant in the system, there would be inflation. Why? Because the supply of goods and services will dwindle. Do you get that? Now, look here very carefully that this supply side problem is mostly related to structural reasons. Got it? Or there could be governance failures also. Like say, for example, there are riots or something kind of scenario which can cause a kind of disruption in the supply chain, and that's why you may face some sort of inflation on that account as well. But generally speaking, you see, we assume that supply remains more or less smooth in an economy, then it is the money supply that generally impacts the level of inflation in the economy. If the money increases in the economy, then per capita money increases. If the overall money supply increases, then money per person also increases, generally speaking. That enhances what? The purchasing power, and that fuels what? That fuels demand. Do you understand that? And when there is more money into the system, like say for example, the central bank is printing more money, that money will be pushed into the banking system, and people will then borrow from the banking system. So there will be more loans. What kind of loans? Individual loans as well as business loans. And whenever you take these kind of loans, you will invest the money or you will spend the money. Whatever be the case, there would be a more demand for consumer goods and capital goods. Like businesses generally demand for capital goods, whereas consumers or individuals generally demand for consumer goods. Like say for example, home loan, car loan could be considered as consumer items. But whereas if you take the loan, you get a car and you put it on say some sort of car service, say Ola, Uber type ka aisa aapne kuch laga diya, then that becomes a capital good for you. Or suppose you buy a house and put it on rent, then that becomes a capital good. Why? Because it is helping in creating some sort of good or service. Here in this case, rental service. Do you get that? So businesses generally they take money from the bank to invest, or they demand capital goods. Do you understand that? Whereas individuals, they take money from the banks to consume, or they demand consumer goods. Whatever be the case, there would be a rise in capital and consumer good prices, and that is across the board price rise, and that's why that's inflation. So generally the central banks, they adopt monetary management through their monetary policy under such cases. And what do? They generally increase the interest rates. So interest rates and inflation, they are directly related or indirectly related? Interest rates and inflation, they are directly related or indirectly related? Rise in inflation will cause what? Increase in interest rate. Whereas decrease in inflation will cause what? Decrease in interest rates. And when we say interest rates, we include all kinds of interest rates. Like say, for example, the repo rate is also an interest rate. And do you remember marginal standing facility? And do you remember SDF? We covered in the last class. And you can also consider this as the rate of interest that banks offer on their credit. जो भी interest है आप बोल सकते हो, all the interests, they are pushed up, and generally they are pushed up because the central bank, it enhances the policy rates. Policy rates means in India repo rate mostly. Do you get that? So what is the relationship between inflation and monetary policy? If I have to summarize this in one line, whenever there is inflation, there is monetary tightening. Do you understand that? Now, if I make a statement, if there is inflation, there will be monetary tightening. Is that statement correct? Not necessarily. Do you get that? Because generally there are other tools as well through which you can control inflation. Like say, for example, you do not do monetary tightening, but you give a kind of guideline to the banks that reduce the consumer loans and increase the capital loans. So people who take loan now invest in infrastructure, say for example, and that will improve the supply side, and thereby in that way will help in curbing inflation. Inflation, after all, is what? It's nothing but it is a mismatch. That is what inflation is. Mismatch between goods and money. Do you understand that? Too much of money chasing too few goods, or too few goods being chased by too much of money, whatever you want to say. That is what inflation is. Correct? So ये relationship होता है monetary policy और inflation का. Let's try to understand what's the relationship between fiscal policy and inflation. Now, when we say fiscal policy, we generally mean the revenue of the government and the expenditure of the government. Let's talk about the expenditure of the government. During times of inflation, you would see that borrowings become cheaper. Obviously, during inflation, money loses its value, and that's why borrowings become cheaper. And governments also borrow. Remember? Like say, for example, to bridge their deficits or to invest, whatever be the scenario. So government borrowings generally go up at that time because borrowings become cheaper during inflation. This is the general scenario. So government's expenditure also go up because money is now easy for everyone. During inflation, there is a lot of money into the system, and that's why everybody can get money at cheaper price. And that's why governments also get more money into their kitty, and they generally increase the expenditure. Well, again, it doesn't mean that if there is more money into the system and government gets more money, government will invest. Not necessarily, because that's a complete policy decision. But generally speaking, government expenditure also go up during times of inflation. Because why? You see, there is something called counterbalancing between fiscal policy and monetary policy. If the central bank increases the interest rates and the governments also keep on reducing their expenditure, then that would be a double whammy on the poor man. Why? Because inflation is poor man's tax, or people with fixed income, they don't like inflation. But people with variable income, they like inflation. Do you understand that? Because as there is more inflation, there is more incentive to produce, and thereby there is more income. So generally, government expenditure increases during times of inflation. Do you understand that? And what about revenue? Obviously, revenue also increases during times of inflation, because if there is inflation, then you can understand that there will be more incentives to producers. If there is more incentives, they would produce more goods and services. Just think like that. And if there is more goods and more services, there is more GST. So in that way, revenues also increase. And if the companies are making more, people will also make more. And that's why there will be more income tax receipts. And that's why be it corporate income, be it personal income, or be it indirect taxes in the form of GST, सब कुछ बढ़ता है. That's why government can increase its expenditure. So on one hand, borrowings become cheaper during inflation, and on the other hand, there is hike in revenue, government revenue. Now this thing continues till the time the central bank pushes the interest rates. When the central bank pushes the interest rate, everything changes. That's why you have something, you have heard about something called accommodative monetary policy. Have you heard about something like that? And there is always a kind of tussle between the government and between the RBI, because government's main agenda is to push growth and development, whereas RBI's main agenda is to control inflation. And these two are two contradictory things. You cannot have both of them at the same time. You have to sacrifice one for the other. So generally what it happens is we push growth, and that also pushes inflation up. But when inflation becomes intolerable, we try to attack inflation. That slows down the economy. But again, we can only tolerate a bit of slowdown. If it slows down drastically, that would cause deflation, and that may also cause a lot of job losses, unemployment. That's why we shift our focus back from inflation towards growth, and we try to push growth again, and then inflation again rises. So it's a kind of seesaw which goes on between the monetary policy and the fiscal policy. Do you understand that? So that's the impact of inflation on fiscal policy. Let's try to understand the impact of inflation on external sector. I hope you remember that I told you that whenever there is increase in money supply, generally we have an inflationary scenario in the economy, right? Now look here. If there is more money, and when I say money, I mean the local currency. Whenever there is more of local currency, then there is depreciation of local currency vis-a-vis the hard currencies, or the US dollar, say for example. So there is currency depreciation whenever there is inflation. Now suppose I'm giving you three statements. First statement is that whenever there is inflation, banks generally increase their interest rates. What do you say to that statement? Is that statement correct? Okay. Second statement, whenever there is inflation, there is increase in government revenues, at least in the short term. Will you say yes to that? Yes. Whenever there is inflation, there is depreciation in the local currency, at least in the short term. Yes. Do you understand that? And whenever there is depreciation, now what happens? You see that if the economy is investment-led economy, it means there is a lot of goods and services that are being produced. Because the moment you invest into the economy, you increase its productive capacity. ये तो बात सही है ना? So if it's an investment-led economy, you know that there would be an increase in the production of goods and services whenever there is inflationary scenario, because that gives an incentive to the producers. And if there is depreciation, it gives an incentive to exporters. You understand that? Because now you can get few dollars and get more money, more local currency for it, because the local currency is depreciated vis-a-vis the US dollar. But ये कब होगा? Export push कब मिलेगा? When it's a investment-led economy. So write one sentence if you want. If the economy is an investment-led economy, if the economy is an investment-led economy, currency depreciation provides an incentive to the exporters, provides an incentive to the exporters. आप ऐसे सोचकर देखो that you are a manufacturer of a soap. Suppose you own a soap factory and you sell your soaps also into the foreign market. So you get dollars in return for selling your soaps. Now suddenly the local currency, the Indian rupee, INR, has depreciated vis-a-vis the USD or the US dollar. Now obviously if you can get dollars into the system, you will fetch more money from the system, and that's why it gives an incentive. But what is the assumption here? You have a factory which is producing soap. It means there is investment into the economy. अब समझ लो आपका factory है ही नहीं. You cannot produce soaps. And whatever you are producing, suppose it is not competitive enough to sell into the foreign markets or in the global markets. So that's why whenever there is currency depreciation, there is no incentive for you. Why? Because rather you are selling your products in the local economy and you cannot sell it in the foreign economy or in the overseas markets, and that's why you cannot fetch dollars. तो depreciation अगर होगा उस केस में तो आपको hurt करेगा वो. Do you understand that? Generally, if the economy is consumption led means it is not investing a lot, it is consuming a lot. So always there would be an investment deficit in such kind of scenarios. Whenever the economy would be consumption led economy, वहां पे एक तरीके का investment deficit होगा हमेशा, क्योंकि consumption है ज्यादा. Do you understand that? तो जब investment deficit होगा तो आपको goods and services उतने तो मिलेंगे नहीं जितने होने चाहिए. It means your demands for goods and services will now be met by, or your extra demand for goods and services will now be met by imports. Do you understand that? ये एक हो सकता है. और secondly, ये scenario है that your economy needs certain goods or services which are indispensable for carrying out production, but you do not produce that good or service. Like say for example, oil. You need oil to run your factories, to run your vehicles, everything. But the point is you do not have any oil reserves. Nature has not blessed you with oil. Or suppose your consumption of oil is too much than the supply of oil in the economy. In such cases also you would be dependent on imports. तो या तो फिर आपके यहाँ पर एक तरीके का इन्वेस्टमेंट डेफिसिट है, या तो फिर कुछ ऐसी चीज चाहिए जो आप प्रोड्यूस ही नहीं कर पाते हो, चाहे आप इन्वेस्टमेंट कर लो तब भी नहीं कर सकते. Do you understand that? Like say for example, if we dig oil wells in every Indian home, will we start getting oil? No, because there is no oil. Do you understand that? तो ऐसा इन्वेस्टमेंट किसी काम भी नहीं आएगा. Rather, it would be wasteful investment or expenditure. Do you get that? So in that way, you see that if the economy is not investment led, there is investment deficit, then currency depreciation or depreciation in the local currency increases the current account deficit. समझ में आ गया? तो ये रिलेशनशिप है. अब देखो मैं आपको 3 सेंटेंसेस फिर बता रहा हूं, आप बोलोगे इसमें ये यस है या फॉल्स है, करेक्ट है या गलत है. फर्स्ट स्टेटमेंट, इफ एन इकोनॉमी इज इन्वेस्टमेंट लेड, इट may have incentives during global inflationary scenarios. No, मैंने ग्लोबल इन्फ्लेशन बोला है. हर जगह इन्फ्लेशन होगा तो फिर तो बात बराबर हो गई ना. Do you understand that? Generally कब होगा? When there is local inflation or the rate of inflation here is more than the rate of inflation in United States of America. ऐसे बोल सकते हो. So the statement was incomplete. It was data not sufficient. So you cannot give an answer to that. But generally speaking, आप ये समझ लो कि जब भी inflation होगा तो अगर consumption based economy है तो कौन सा inflation होगा? वो demand pull. और कैसा inflation होगा? Retail inflation. Inflation अगर इन्वेस्टमेंट बेस्ड इकोनॉमी या इन्वेस्टमेंट लेड इकोनॉमी है तो इट वुड बी मोस्टली कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन. यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? एंड कॉस्ट पुश इन्फ्लेशन कुड आल्सो बी एट द लेवल ऑफ होलसेलर और एट द लेवल ऑफ प्रोड्यूसर, नॉट नेसेसरली एट द लेवल ऑफ रिटेलर, बट डिमांड पुल इज ऑलवेज मोस्टली एट द लेवल ऑफ रिटेल. और हमारी इकोनॉमी कैसी इकोनॉमी है? कंजम्पशन बेस्ड. दैट्स व्हाई हेडलाइन इन्फ्लेशन फॉर अस CPIC मेक्स सेंस, WPI डजंट मेक सेंस फॉर अस अ लॉट. अब समझ में आया कि क्यों उसको हेडलाइन इन्फ्लेशन बनाया गया. इन्फ्लेशन का रिलेशनशिप जो है फिस्कल पॉलिसी, मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी और एक्सटर्नल सेक्टर से ऐसा है कि फिस्कल पॉलिसी में रेवेन्यू और एक्सपेंडिचर दोनों बढ़ते हैं शॉर्ट टर्म में, लेकिन लॉन्ग टर्म में हो सकता है दोनों नीचे आ जाए. मॉनेटरी पॉलिसी का ऐसा है कि व्हेनेवर देयर इज राइज इन इन्फ्लेशन देयर इज राइज इन इंटरेस्ट रेट एंड वाइस वर्सा. और एक्सटर्नल सेक्टर का ऐसा है कि व्हेनेवर देयर इज इन्फ्लेशन स्पेशली ड्यू टू द इंक्रीज इन मनी सप्लाई इनटू द सिस्टम, देयर वुड बी डेप्रिसिएशन of local currency. Depreciation of local currency gives an incentive to producers but also makes important vital imports very costly. Do you understand that? And that enhances what? The current account deficit. अब एक बात जो ध्यान देने की है यहां पर, ये मैंने आइडियल सिनेरियोस की बात की है कि इकोनॉमी कंजम्पशन बेस्ड है या इन्वेस्टमेंट लेड है. जनरली ऑल इकोनॉमीज आर हाइब्रिड इकोनॉमीज. Some sectors are consumption based, some sectors are investment led. Do you understand that? Like if you see India's IT sector, it's investment led. It is not consumption based a lot, because most of the things that we are producing, the IT software solutions that we are making, Do we have a lot of demand for that in the local economy? Maybe not, especially the high-end products. Do you understand that? We have a lot of demand for that in Canada, USA, Western European countries, Australia, New Zealand, etc. So that's why we can always fetch the US dollars as far as the service sector is concerned. Do you get it? तो बात इतनी ही है कि ये सिनेरियो होता है इन्फ्लेशन का. ये सारा सिनेरियो आपको समझ में आ गया? Now we will try to see how inflation has been in India across the past 12 months and where we are heading towards as far as inflation is concerned. Now, look here very carefully. You know that there was COVID-19 first, and then there was supply chain disruption due to the Ukraine war. That's why there was a lot of inflation in food, fertilizer, and fuel. Do you understand that? और जब inflation होता है एक low income, middle income economy में, तो मोस्टली जो है वो इन्फ्लेशन वो नेसेसिटीज में होता है, लग्जरीज में नहीं. व्हाई? बिकॉज इन इंडिया यू सी दैट इफ थिंक ऑफ एन एवरेज इंडियन, द फर्स्ट प्रायोरिटी इज फूड. डू यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? एंड बेसिक्स ऑफ लाइफ. देन ओनली दे थिंक अबाउट लग्जरीज. कितने इंडियन हाउस होल्ड्स हैं जिनके पास पैसा आता है तो वो सबसे पहले सोचते हैं कि अब रोल्स रॉयस तो लेना ही पड़ेगा? बहुत कम ही होते होंगे. डू यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? मोस्टली दे थिंक अबाउट बेसिक्स. एंड देन अगर इन्वेस्टमेंट की भी बात उनके दिमाग में आती है तो दे थिंक अबाउट बेसिक इन्वेस्टमेंट, लाइक से फॉर एग्जांपल एजुकेशन ऑफ चिल्ड्रन. इट कुड बी इन्वेस्टमेंट इन द सोशल सेक्टर. डू यू गेट इट? सच काइंड ऑफ इन्वेस्टमेंट, मे बी अ हाउस आफ्टर दैट, बट दैट एक्चुअली इज नॉट एन इन्वेस्टमेंट टू सम एक्सटेंट, बट यू कैन कॉल इट इन्वेस्टमेंट. इट इंक्रीजेस द परचेजिंग पावर if there is good housing schemes by the government for low income groups. Like say we had the Indira Awas Yojana, then we have Atal Awas Yojana and all those kind of things. Anyhow, so point ये है कि इंडिया में इन्फ्लेशन जो है वो जो कंजम्पशन बास्केट अगर आप देखोगे लोगों का एवरेज, तो उसमें नेसेसिटीज ज्यादा हैं, लग्जरीज कम है. तो जो इन्फ्लेशन हमारे यहाँ आया है वो कैसा है? रिटेल इन्फ्लेशन है पहला, और दूसरा कहां पर है? ज्यादा फूड में है. You get it? Why? Because of the Ukraine-Russia tussle as well. And also you see that we have to face 2 successive droughts and then some bad monsoons also. There was occasional hailstorm in Maharashtra, say for example, that caused a loss of a lot of your produce, agricultural produce. But जो अच्छी बात ये है कि हमारा एक inflation target है, which is 4 ± 2. And RBI is not comfortable if the inflation goes beyond 6%. Do you understand that? RBI is not comfortable in India. The good news is that we slightly breached that mark, but we are showing signs of coming down. Do you understand that? And in the near future, you will see that that will come down further. One major reason for that is we covered in the last class is the withdrawal of excise duty on oil. ठीक है? वो लगा दिया था ना गवर्नमेंट ने पहले उसको, फिर मई में भी एक बार उसको पीछे किया है, तो उसकी वजह से यू नो दैट डिक्रीजेस द ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कॉस्ट्स. फ्यूल कॉस्ट इज वन इंपॉर्टेंट कंपोनेंट ऑफ ट्रांसपोर्टेशन कॉस्ट, एंड देयरफॉर दैट आल्सो डिक्रीजेस द ओवरऑल प्राइस ऑफ गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज. एडवांस इकोनॉमीज में अगर आप देखोगे तो उनके यहाँ बहुत इन्फ्लेशन है. इनफैक्ट इन सम ऑफ द वेस्टर्न यूरोपियन कंट्रीज दे आर फेसिंग इन्फ्लेशन व्हिच इज एन ऑल टाइम हाई इन द लास्ट 40 years. इतना कभी नहीं उनको देखने को मिला. And that was majorly because of the COVID-19 pushed slowdown. Counter-cyclical monetary policies. Remember the US Fed Reserve and all the central banks, they first adopted quantitative easing, but then they started doing quantitative hardening or tight monetary policy. और जैसे उन्होंने tight monetary policy किया, what happened? Dollars started flying out of emerging markets and developing economies. And because of that, there was large-scale depreciation, especially in oil-deficient, high oil-consuming economies like India. We had to face CAD kind of scenario. But thank God we have something called the Forex Reserve. And why we have a lot of Forex reserves? Because of a service export, because our invisibles are in positive. They are not in negative. Our merchandise is mostly in negative. It means our balance of trade is in negative. But our balance of services is in positive mostly. ठीक है? ऊपर से रेमिटेंस. कितने लोग हैं जो बाहर काम करते हैं और इंडिया में पैसा भेजते हैं? आप ऐसा या इंडियन डायस्पोरा को सोच के देखो. और कितने लोग हैं बाहर वाले जो इंडिया में काम करके बाहर पैसा भेजते हैं? Now you compare these two numbers. Indian diaspora will outnumber these people any day. Do you understand that? Foreigners working in India and sending remittances. So remittance is also net positive. Invisibles जो है वो भी हमारे पॉजिटिव है. और हमारे कैपिटल अकाउंट पे भी अगर देखोगे FDI, जितना आता है इंडिया में और इंडियंस जितना देते हैं बाहर जाके एफडीआई करके, इंडियंस आल्सो डू अ लॉट ऑफ एफडीआई, but the amount of FDI that comes into India is anyhow more than the amount of FDI that Indians do in outside markets. And there is also something called portfolio money. Portfolio money also comes in. So net में क्या होता है, हमारे पास इतना बच जाता है कि हम बैलेंस ऑफ पेमेंट को बैलेंस भी कर लेते हैं. इट मीन्स जो हमारा कैड है उसको हम डेफिसिट को भर भी लेते हैं, उसके बाद भी पैसा बच जाता है. वी एड इट वेयर टू द फॉरेक्स रिजर्व. दैट्स व्हाई देयर इज अ कंटिन्यूअस इंक्रीज इन अ forex reserves. Do you get that? Economies like Pakistan are facing this problem कि उनके पास एक तो उनके forex reserves dwindle हो रहे हैं, and their exports, merchandise export तो और भी बुरा हाल है वहां पे मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर का. सर्विसेज भी उनकी उतनी नहीं है, वो उनकी भी सर्विसेज पॉजिटिव में है वैसे, लेकिन उतनी नहीं है. Do you understand that? They do not have that kind of a boom like Indian service sector. So जो इतनी बातों का जिसे कहते हैं लब्बुल बाब ये है कि इंडियन इन्फ्लेशनरी सिनेरियो इज बेटर. सो हमारे ग्रोथ प्रोस्पेक्ट भी अच्छे हैं और हमारे इन्फ्लेशन सिनेरियो भी बेटर है. हमारा कौन सा इन्फ्लेशन मोस्टली हमको प्रॉब्लमेटिक लगता है, कौन सा इन्फ्लेशन हमको ट्रबल करता है? फूड इन्फ्लेशन. डू यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? रिटेल फूड इन्फ्लेशन, बिकॉज फूड इज समथिंग विच इज रिक्वायर्ड बाय एवरीवन. एवरीवन मीन्स इट हर्ट्स द पुअरेस्ट. डू यू गेट इट? Inflation is poor man's tax. Okay, if I make a statement, you tell me who benefit during inflation, creditors or debtors? Who benefit during inflation, creditors or debtors? Creditors means those who have given loans. Debtor means those who have taken loans. Who benefits? Why? Yes, because there is fall in the value of money. Do you get it? Now, suppose in 2021, 1,000 rupees can get you a product X. Do you get it? Or suppose you are the seller. You sold it, the product X, and you got how much? 1,000 rupees. Now there is inflation. You get 1,500 rupees for the same product. Do you get it? There is a 50% inflation. Less. Suppose ऐसा होता नहीं है, just for the sake of mathematics. इतना हो गया. And suppose this is the year 2024. मतलब 3 साल में 50% rise हो गया. Inflation तो आपके प्रोडक्ट में भी जंप आया है, तो आपको 1,500 मिलता है. And you took a loan of 1,000 rupees for a 3-year tenure at 10% interest. It means you have to return how much? 1,100 rupees. Do you understand that? But your product once fetched you 1,000 rupees. Now it is fetching you 1,500 rupees. Do you get that? और अब बात क्या है? देखो ये सिनेरियो तब होगा कि अब कुछ लोग ये सोच सकते हैं कि अगर इन्फ्लेशन हुआ है तो इनपुट कॉस्ट भी बढ़ा होगा, तो प्रोडक्शन कॉस्ट भी बढ़ा होगा, तो मार्जिन घटा होगा. बट ये सोचकर देखो कि ये शर्ट जो है, या समझ लो एक एक्स एक शर्ट है, समझ लो ये प्रोडक्ट जो है ये 2021 में ही बनाया गया था और इन्वेंट्री में पड़ा हुआ था. समझ में आया? तब तो कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन वही लगा होगा ना. लाइक से फॉर एग्जांपल द कॉस्ट ऑफ प्रोडक्शन वाज 800 रुपीस. फॉर दिस आल्सो इट इज 800 रुपीस एंड मे बी द मेंटेनेंस कॉस्ट. अगर नॉन पेरिशेबल आइटम है, समझ लो ऐसा जिसको कोल्ड स्टोरेज नहीं लगता, तो इसका मतलब वो कॉस्ट भी बच गया आपका. और समझ लो क्लाइमेट ऐसा है आपके जगह का, सपोज यू आर लिविंग इन जीरो वैली. आर यू अवेयर अबाउट जीरो वैली? वेयर? इन अरुणाचल प्रदेश. इट्स वेरी ब्यूटीफुल. वहां पर अगर आप रहते हो तो आपको कोई जरूरत नहीं है. इट्स वेरी गुड क्लाइमेट इन देयर. सो यू कैन प्रोड्यूस एंड यू कैन स्टोर थिंग्स, स्पेशली टेक्सटाइल, फॉर अ लॉन्ग पीरियड ऑफ टाइम, राइट? और अगर सिंथेटिक हुआ तो फिर तो और भी लंबा टिकेगा, क्योंकि कॉटन फाइबर हुआ तो फिर भी उसमें थोड़ा सा प्रॉब्लम आ सकता है. बट अगर सिंथेटिक हुआ इट विल स्टे फॉर अ लॉन्गर पीरियड ऑफ टाइम. And it would be also easy to manufacture. Why? Because synthetic fibers, उसको scale करना बड़ा आसान होता है. Because automation is very easy. So you understand that? हर सेक्टर, हर फैक्ट्री जहां पे ऑटोमेशन आसान होगा तो वो अच्छा होगा. Have you heard about something called EBITDA? EBITDA, have you heard about something like this? अरे हाँ ना, कुछ तो बोलो. You heard about this? What is this? What is this? You might have heard this with respect to startups. Now this is a good indicator of how much or where an economy is. Earnings before income, taxes, depreciation and amortization. Earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation and amortization. इंटरेस्ट मतलब आपने कोई लोन लिया होगा, आप एक फैक्ट्री चलाते हैं समझ लो, तो उस फैक्ट्री को चलाने के लिए आपने कुछ लोन लिया होगा, उस लोन पे आपको एक इंटरेस्ट देना पड़ेगा, तो आपके ओवरऑल इनकम में से तो जाएगा ना इंटरेस्ट. सो योर अर्निंग विच इज बिफोर पेमेंट ऑफ इंटरेस्ट, देन टैक्सेस, इट मींस योर डिस्पोजेबल अर्निंग की बात नहीं हो रही है यहाँ पे. डेप्रिसिएशन, लाइक से फॉर एग्जांपल आपकी फैक्ट्री में आपने कोई मशीन लगाया है, उसकी रिपेयरिंग कुछ कॉस्ट आती होगी, depreciation. And amortization, it means repayment of the loan. तो ये कितना है किसी सेक्टर में, तो आपको पता चलेगा कि वो सेक्टर कैसा परफॉर्म कर. सो इट्स अ गुड इंडिकेटर. एंड टुडे यू वुड सी, अब सब बोलते रहेंगे, जो भी फाउंडर्स होते हैं स्टार्टअप्स के, वो बोलते हैं कि हमारा जो EBITDA है वो बर्न रेट चल रहा है अभी. इट मींस दे आर बर्निंग कैश. यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? मतलब उनका जो कैक है, customer acquisition cost, it's too high. Like say for example, they're spending 40 rupees to earn say 1 rupee. ऐसा सिनेरियो चल रहा है उनका. So that's also this entire thing you can understand with respect to inflation. But ये बहुत higher level understanding हो जाएगी. Anyhow, let's now try to understand how the scenario is with respect to inflation in India. Look at the heading of the chapter. I told you that जो second part होता है वो generally थोड़ा philosophical होता है. Prices and inflation, successful tightrope walking. Now what is tightrope walking? आपने देखा होगा in circus they walk over ropes with a stick in their hand. It's like a balancing act. And remember the fiscal policy and the monetary policy, they play a kind of balancing to each other. Let's take a look. Rising prices are always a cause of concern for policymakers as they hurt the common man the most. Do you understand this statement? The perils of inflation are felt more in developing economies where necessities have a higher share in the consumption basket than in developed economies. Do you understand that? In developed economies, maybe luxuries are having a higher share. In recent years, India's inflation rate has been largely under control, lying below the RBI's target rate of 4% from 2017 to 19. But उसके बाद कोरोना आ गया, आपको पता है, and because of it, the inflation breached the 6% mark, but it has come down drastically. In 2020, supply-side disruptions pushed inflations beyond the RBI's upper tolerance limit of 6%. The pandemic delivered a larger shock on supply than it did on demand. Remember, in fact, demand increased during. याद है आपको जब पहली बार लॉकडाउन अनाउंस किया गया था, how people behaved the next day? There was a run on the grocery shops. The pandemic delivered a large shock through supply chain disruption in the case of essential goods, food, medicine, and industrial goods. In turn, this aggravated cost push inflation in the economy. आपको समझ में आ रहा है? जब भी सप्लाई खराब होगा तो कौन सा होगा? कॉस्ट पुश. जब भी मनी बढ़ेगा अंदर तो क्या होगा? डिमांड. ये क्लियर हो गई बात? वेरी गुड. As the pandemic receded, the conflict in Russia-Ukraine broke out, bringing in its wake worldwide inflation, fueled mostly by surging prices of crude oil and other commodities. Prices soared to a decadal high and ate into household budgets, which in turn forced central banks to tighten monetary policy to avert stagflation-like situation. Now, what is stagflation? It's the worst of all scenarios, where you have high inflation and you have stagnation. It means growth is also coming down. ऐसा क्यों होगा? क्यों होगा? How? You tell me. How this is going to happen? You tell me that if there is inflation, we know that inflation gives an incentive to the producers. So how there can be a slowdown due to inflation? How these two can happen? How this two is related? Okay. Okay. Think of other reasons also. ठीक है, सोचो क्यों. Now look, you have to think from every angle. When there is inflation, especially if it's an emerging market or developing economy, let's consider that case because हमारा syllabus Indian economy है ना. So suppose if that is the scenario, then inflation is mostly what kind of inflation? Retail inflation. Inflation is what kind of inflation? Food inflation or inflation in basics and not in luxuries. And people, a lot number of people, suppose this is the total labor force, a lot of them are wage earners or salaried people. Some of them could be casual workers or freelancers, but most of them have fixed income. Labor force mein to yahi hai. And you see, now they have a choice to make between necessity and luxury. Average households will make a choice in favor of necessity. When that happens, then in the luxury sector, we start experiencing a kind of fall in demand. You understand that? But they also suffer. The people who are working in the luxury sector or the managers of luxury sector or the producers of luxury sector, they also start facing the brunt of inflation. And that's why जब उनकी luxury car नहीं बिक रही है, plasma TV नहीं बिक रहा है, smartphone नहीं बिक रहा है, because there is food inflation. Do you understand that? That's why they do a lot of layoff. Do you understand that? Now, when there is job losses, people do two things. First, there is a run on the banks. They start taking money out. Anyhow, during inflation, keeping money in the bank is not at all attractive. Do you get that? So they start taking money out and they invest that money into the economy, which further pushes inflation because their investment, आप बैंक से पैसा निकाल रहे हो, आप उड़ाओगे थोड़ी ना उसको. You will use that in your necessities first. So again, there is a further push to retail inflation, food inflation, inflation in basic commodities. समझ में आ रहा है ये? And on the other hand, they try to seek or find job in the sector that deals with necessities. Like say for example, FMCG sector पे बाढ़ आ जाती है कि हमको job चाहिए उस sector में. Now, when there is lot of people applying, obviously you know the average salary comes down, isn't it? So when the salary comes down, then you can understand that again people want to spend only in necessities. Further, you can say slow down in the luxury sector, more layoffs, and this spiral keeps on continuing. Do you get it? And इससे होगा क्या? When there is more and more layoff, there comes a time that there is capacity utilization. It comes down. Capacity utilization means, like say for example, a factory has 10 machines, but you are using only 3 machines. So it means your capacity utilization is 30%. Do you get that? So capacity utilization keeps on coming down. And if capacity utilization keeps on coming down, you understand that nobody wants to carry on an overburdened capital infrastructure. So they start selling it. And as they start selling capital goods, does that further reduces the productive capacity of the economy? So it means the economy is now moving towards slow down. Whereas on the other hand, there is rise in prices continuously and there is inflation. So stagflation से बचने के लिए ही जो है आप देखोगे, this is what was done. See, households budget when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out and COVID-19 happened, which in turn forced central banks to tighten monetary policy to avoid stagflation-like situations, so as to stop the run on the banks. Do you understand that? Interest rate बढ़ाओगे तो उधर savings interest rate भी बढ़ेगा, and money becomes attractive then, and that's why you want to keep money into the banking system. तो अब बार-बार बहुत ज़्यादा, मतलब कुल मिलाकर ये है कि ATM कम जाना, UPI कम यूज करवाना. इन्फ्लेशन के टाइम पे यही होता है टारगेट. Now, Let's take a look at how the scenario is worldwide. In advanced economies, the rate of inflation is projected by IMF to increase from 3.1% in 2021 to 7.2% in 2022, the highest since 1982. मतलब 40 years में ऐसा हो रहा है पहली बार कि इतना growth आया inflation में. The euro area saw the rate reach 10%. यूरोप इज द वर्स्ट सफरर, राइट, बिकॉज ऑफ रशिया यूक्रेन. यूएस के पास तो अपना कुछ शेल गैस वगैरह भी है, बट यूरोप तो पूरा ही डिपेंडेंट था रशिया के ऊपर. एंड देन यू सी द यूएस इन्फ्लेशन रीच्ड इट्स 40-year हाई एट 9%. तो देखो कैसा रेट चल रहा है, 7.2%, 10%, 9%. ये एडवांस इकोनॉमीज की बात हो रही है. यूके सॉ एन एनुअल प्राइस राइज ऑफ 9.2%. जर्मनी विटनेस्ड 8.6%. Among all emerging markets, Brazil saw a moderation in price trend. Turkey's inflation was above 80%. मतलब आप समझ रहे हो? And also, Turkey has got affected further by the earthquake. So things are not so good in Turkey. तो ये दिखा रहा है, एक ट्रेंड दिखा रहा है. The blue is for the advanced economies, whereas the red one is for emerging markets and developing economies. How across the years from 2010 to 2023, how inflation has moved in these economies. तो ट्रेंड आपको ये याद रखना है that emerging markets में generally rate of inflation ज्यादा होता है advanced economies से. Do you understand that? Because they face what kind of inflation? Retail and food mostly. India's management of inflation. अब देखो जो good story है इसमें. The fiscal and monetary measures adopted to stave off the pandemic-induced economic woes were prudent, it means wise, and well-calibrated, means gradual. India did not overstimulate. You understand this term? Stimulus, fiscal stimulus. तो fiscal stimulus बहुत ज़्यादा नहीं दिया गया. In fact, जब oil सस्ता हुआ, तो हमने क्या किया? Excise duty लगा दी. And that was criticized all around. Because I told you that popular understanding of society and economic understanding of society are two different things. Excessive heat in summer and uneven rainfall thereafter in some parts of the country affected the farm sector, especially in Maharashtra. You see, hailstorm वो बहुत problem हुआ, reducing supply and causing prices of some major products to rise. India's inflation rate peaked in April 2022, 7.8%, before moderating to 5.7% in December 22 on the back of good monsoons as well as prompt government measures that ensured adequate food supply. Global economic slowdown and interest rate increases brought down commodity prices, contributing to a substantial decline in wholesale price inflation. Thus, input price pressures on Indian manufacturers reduced because of the improvement in the supply chain. Core inflation. Now, what is this term? Core inflation. What is it? Is it inflation in core sector? Is that core inflation? क्या होता है core inflation? Yes, inflation excluding those commodities which are highly volatile in nature, like food and fuel. Do you understand that? That is core inflation. अब core inflation में आप कुछ भी डाल सकते हो, मतलब उससे exclude कर सकते हो कोई भी item जो volatile हो. इंडिया केस में क्या होता है? Mostly food and fuel, क्योंकि उसके prices हर दिन बदलते रहते हैं. देखो आलू जितने में आज मिल रहा है कल किसी और प्राइस में मिलेगा, पेट्रोल का भी वही हाल है. They are not static, right? But कोई स्मार्टफोन है उसके प्राइस बहुत जल्दी चेंज नहीं होते. So core inflation remains sticky at nearly 6%. Core inflation is a good indicator for policymakers, because if you consider overall inflation, you do not get a good picture of the economy and reflects the second round effects of supply chain shocks witnessed earlier this year. Second round means the Russia-Ukraine. Further, with the recovery of demand, there has been a pickup in the service inflation. और आपको ये भी समझ में आएगा कि हमारे यहाँ contact services वो ऊपर गए हैं because of vaccine powered living. Do you understand that? And that's why the markets, the bazaars started opening up. And as the bazaars opened up, you know, contact services, contact market, that also pushed the inflation. जो ये markets होते हैं, like have you seen in the Karol Bagh region there's a market in the Monday market. तो ये जो फुटपाथ पे जो मार्केट लगते हैं ये सारे खत्म हो गए थे कोरोना के टाइम पे, बट ये वापस आ गए सारे. मतलब वो सरोजनी वाला जो हाल होता है वो वापस हो गया, तो उसकी वजह से भी काफी इन्फ्लेशन हुआ. Now, look here. Headline inflation declined from its peak. What is headline inflation in India? CPIC. ठीक है. अब ये क्वेश्चन आ सकता है आपको, सीधा सीधा क्वेश्चन आ जाता है that headline inflation in India is measured by first CPIC, CPIU, CPIR, WPI. Do you understand that? CPIAL, CPI, urban workers, UW, agricultural laborers, कुछ भी हो सकता है. बट आपको क्या याद रखना है कि कौन सा होता है वो सीपीआई सी कंबाइंड। कंबाइंड का मतलब रूरल प्लस अर्बन और रर्बन। सो लुक हियर, एवरेज एनुअल रिटेल इन्फ्लेशन बेस्ड ऑन सीपीआई। तो अब ये तो एक टेबल है जिसमें फूड एंड बेवरेजेस, सीरियल्स, प्रोडक्ट्स, मीट एंड फिश, एग, मिल्क एंड products, oil and fats, fruits, vegetables, pulses and products. Now, look here one thing, that in India, we are also facing a strange kind of scenario wherein there is a lot of push to the protein consumption. ठीक है, और प्रोटीन से जो एरिया है, कंपोनेंट है आपके फूड का, दैट इज इंक्रीजिंग डे बाय डे, एंड देयरफॉर फिश, पोल्ट्री, मिल्क, पल्सेस, इन सब में हमको इन्फ्लेशन दिख रहा है। शुगर एंड कन्फेक्शनरी, स्पाइसेस, पैन, टोबैको एंड इंटॉक्सिकेंट, क्लोथिंग एंड फुटवेयर, हाउसिंग, मतलब ये सारी चीजें क्या है, रिटेल चीजें हैं। ठीक है, तो अगर आप देखोगे इन सब में लगभग लगभग इन्फ्लेशन आया है, बट फिर बाद में धीरे धीरे मॉडरेशन भी आया। तो लाइक से फॉर एग्जांपल ट्रांसपोर्ट एंड कम्युनिकेशन में 10% से 6.4% हो गया, और रीजन क्या है, वही पेट्रोल और डीजल का जो एक्साइज ड्यूटी था उसको पीछे लेना। नाउ लुक एट दिस, रिटेल इन्फ्लेशन ड्रिवन बाय फूड कमोडिटीज। CPI inflation, retail inflation, it went through 3 phases in 2022. अब देखो, ये बिल्कुल याद रखने की जरूरत नहीं है कि कितने फेज थे, कितना परसेंट था, कोई नहीं पूछने वाला आपको. So do not waste your time in remembering these kind of things, which peaked at 7.8% along with a holding phase of 7% and declined to around 5.7% by the year end, mainly driven by higher food inflation, while core inflation stayed at a moderate level. Higher food inflation estimated using consumer food price index, food inflation climbed to 7% in financial year 23 from 3.8% in financial year 22, with major price rise seen in vegetables, cereals, milk and spices. Reason क्या है इसका? क्या reason है? 3 reason है. पहला क्या? Contact services, economy opening up, so demand side पे वो push आया. दूसरा, रशिया यूक्रेन वॉर, सप्लाई साइड डिसरप्शन आया. और तीसरा, गवर्नमेंट ने कुछ एक्सपेंडिचर भी ज्यादा किया था, लाइक से फॉर एग्जांपल नरेगा, रिमेंबर एसेट्स बनाए जा रहे थे घर पे, तो लोगों की इनकम में भी उछाल आया, और जिसकी वजह से थोड़ा फूड इन्फ्लेशन जो है वो बढ़ गया इंडिया में. बट एनी हाउ इट इज अंडर कंट्रोल नाउ. राइजिंग एडिबल ऑयल प्राइसेस. अच्छा, एक चीज आप ध्यान रखना, इंडिया मीट्स इट 60% ऑफ एडिबल ऑयल नीड्स थ्रू इंपोर्ट्स. ठीक है, और ऐसा ऑयल तो है ही है, एडिबल ऑयल भी हमको चाहिए बहुत सारा इंपोर्ट से. The international price pressures directly affected the edible oil prices worldwide. India meets 60% of its edible oil demand through imports. Now, measures to contain inflation in essential food commodities. अब इससे कई बार आपको क्वेश्चन बन के आ जाएगा कि which of the following measures can be adopted to control inflation? Do you understand that? So let me give you certain kind of conditions. First condition is we decide export quotas. We fix export quotas. We allow exports not to go beyond that. Will that help in curbing inflation? Yes or no? Yes. Second, we put a higher custom duty. Will that control inflation? Imports will become costly. That would cause import push inflation. तो कस्टम ड्यूटी क्या होती है, जनरली कम की जाती है. ठीक है, और एक्सपोर्ट पे क्या किया जाता है, बैन किया जाता है मोस्टली, स्पेशली एसेंशियल एक्सपोर्ट्स पे. समझ में आया? अब देखो कुछ चीजें, जैसे सीरियल्स, wheat flour exports were regulated along with maida and suji. The government also imposed an export duty of 20% on rice, brown rice and semi-milled as well as wholly milled rice, except parboiled rice. जो एक बार उबला हुआ होता है ना थोड़ा सा, वो. तो देखो एक्सपोर्ट ड्यूटी बढ़ाई गई, मतलब एक्सपोर्ट्स को क्या किया जाता है, तब डिस्करेज किया जाता है, और इंपोर्ट अगर आ रहा है, इंपोर्ट के कॉस्ट को घटाने की कोशिश की जाती है. Pulses, a buffer stock of pulses has been maintained for price stabilization and a calibrated release was made into the market to moderate the price. But इसके लिए क्या चाहिए हमको, इन्फ्लेशन देखो खत्म करना है अगर हमेशा के लिए, तो हमको चाहिए एक चेन ऑफ कोल्ड स्टोरेज नेटवर्क, राइट? बिकॉज हमारे पास बहुत सारा अनाज हो जाता है, कई बार आपने देखा होगा, इंडिया इज नेट फूड सरप्लस और फूड डेफिसिट. फूड डेफिसिट बट सीरियल्स प्रोडक्शन सरप्लस. है ना, देयर आर लॉट ऑफ हंग्री पीपल इन इंडिया, फूड डेफिसिट है हमारे पास, लेकिन सीरियल्स जो है वो बफर स्टॉक बहुत है, क्योंकि यू गो टू एफसीआई गोडाउन, आप देखो कि बाहर पड़ के अनाज सड़ रहा है, बिल्कुल गेहूं पड़ा हुआ है, अनाज पड़ा हुआ है बाहर सड़ रहा है वो बिल्कुल। वाई? बिकॉज वी डू नॉट हैव कोल्ड स्टोरेज नेटवर्क। द पॉइंट इज, आपके जैसे ही एग्रीकल्चरल सेक्टर में रिफॉर्म की बात करो तो सारा पॉलिटिक्स लैंडस्केप जो है वो हिल जाता है, एंड इट इज अ वेरी डेलिकेट सेक्टर। बट अगर हम एग्रीकल्चरल इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर नहीं बनाएंगे, then we will not be able to control inflation and will not be able to double farmers income, जिसकी बात हो रही थी, वो भी नहीं हो सकता unless we do that. So buffer stock बनाए जाते हैं, ये याद रखना, during inflation. Edible oils, the basic duty on refined palm oil and crude palm oil was reduced. Duty means custom duty. तो custom duty कम की जाती है, excise duty बढ़ाई जाती है, buffer stock बनाए जाते हैं. Do you understand that? During inflation, these are some of the measures to curb inflation. रूरल अर्बन इन्फ्लेशन डिफरेंशियल हैज डिक्लाइन। अच्छा, एक चीज हम देखते थे पहले, दैट इन द अर्बन एरियाज द रेट ऑफ इन्फ्लेशन वाज ऑलवेज हाई। व्हाई? बिकॉज इन द अर्बन एरियाज पीपल्स परचेजिंग पावर वाज गुड। यू गेट दैट? बट इन रूरल एरियाज यू विल नॉट फाइंड दैट काइंड ऑफ एन इन्फ्लेशन, especially in the last decade. That is what the scenario was. Like, say for example, simply just assume, hire a rickshaw wala or you get that kind of services, right? आप एक ऑटो हायर करो यहाँ पर कनॉट प्लेस में हायर करो, सपोज he will ask you for x distance, suppose y money. You can travel 2x distance as y/4 money in a rural area. समझ में आया क्या बोला मैंने? क्यों? क्योंकि वहां पर आप देखोगे वो भी वही सेम सर्विस दे रहा है, कंफर्ट लेवल भी सेम है, हो सकता है उनके दोनों के जो व्हीकल्स है वो भी मैन्युफैक्चर्ड बाय द सेम कंपनी, सेम मॉडल, सेम कंफर्ट लेवल, एवरीथिंग सेम, बट वहां पे प्राइसेस कम। तो जो डिफरेंशियल था अर्बन इन्फ्लेशन और रूरल इन्फ्लेशन, बहुत बड़ा था, गैप था उसमें बहुत ज्यादा। यू अंडरस्टैंड दैट? दैट्स व्हाई इवन इफ पीपल हु वर अर्निंग फ्यू अमाउंट ऑफ मनी इन अर्बन एरियाज, दे वर सेंडिंग दैट मनी टू द रूरल एरिया। अगर आप पूरे मैक्रो और मेजो लेवल पे देखो, तो एक मैक्रो लेवल पे अगर आप देखोगे तो बाहर से लोग इंडिया में पैसा भेजते हैं, और मेजो लेवल पे देखोगे तो लोग अर्बन एरिया से रूरल एरिया में पैसा भेजते हैं। बट थोड़ा रिवर्स फ्लो भी होता है, रूरल टू अर्बन भी होता है, स्पेशली स्टूडेंट्स के लिए, ठीक है? वो पैसा जब आता है, क्योंकि वो एक तरीके का इन्वेस्टमेंट वाला पैसा है। अब ये बात अलग है कि वो इन्वेस्टमेंट कर रहे हो कि नहीं, बट है तो इन्वेस्टमेंट का पैसा ना, उड़ाने का नहीं। So let's take a look at this. Rural urban inflation has remained above its urban counterpart throughout the current fiscal year. मतलब रूरल में जो इन्फ्लेशन रेट है वो अर्बन इन्फ्लेशन रेट से ऊपर रहा है पहली बार। So why is that happen? Assets that were built on individual land, समझ में आया? तो उससे परचेजिंग पावर बढ़ी, और इससे एक तरीके का फायदा भी है, क्योंकि अगर रूरल इन्फ्लेशन, अच्छा मुझे ये बताओ आप, अगर रूरल इन्फ्लेशन ना हो, बिल्कुल नीचे हो, तो ये अच्छा है या बुरा है? इफ सपोज देयर इज नो रूरल इन्फ्लेशन बट ओनली अर्बन इन्फ्लेशन, इज गुड और बैड फॉर द इकोनॉमी? व्हाई? What happens to wages during inflation? They go up or they come down? Wages during inflation, they go up. Do you understand that? Because inflation की वजह से इंसेंटिव मिलता है प्रोड्यूसर को प्रोड्यूस करने के लिए, सो ईदर यू हैव टू डू ओवर टाइम, तो उसके लिए आपको कुछ मिलता है, और यू गेट मोर पीपल, सो दोज हु वर नॉट अर्निंग स्टार्ट अर्निंग, दोज हु वर अर्निंग स्टार्ट अर्निंग मोर, सो वेजेस जनरली गो अप ड्यूरिंग इन्फ्लेशन। यू गेट दैट? और अगर वेज ऊपर जाएगा अर्बन एरियाज में, will that not attract a lot of rural semi-skilled unskilled people? So there would be a stream of rural to urban migration. इंडिया में कैसा होता है? sex selective migration, mostly male migration, and that would cause a burden on the women. So feminization of agriculture, वो सारे problems तो होंगे। लेकिन अगर rural inflation भी हुआ तो कुछ diversification of economic activity होगी, कुछ लोग फैक्ट्री जाके रूरल एरिया में भी लगाएंगे, और वहां पे भी इनकम बढ़ेगा, तो लोग वहीं पे अपना कोई इनकम देखना चाहेंगे। सो इन दैट वे देयर वुड बी लेस बर्डन ऑन द अर्बन लैंडस्केप, एंड देयरफॉर दैट इज व्हाट इज नोन एज बैलेंस्ड ग्रोथ और इंक्लूसिव ग्रोथ। अदरवाइज इट इज एक्सक्लूसिव अर्बन हॉटस्पॉट लेड ग्रोथ। यू गेट इट? ऑल्सो यू लुक एट दिस कि जैसे ही रूरल एरिया में थोड़ा इन्फ्लेशन होगा, तो एक रिवर्स माइग्रेशन भी होगी, और अगर दो इकोनॉमिक हॉटस्पॉट्स बन जाए, रूरल और अर्बन हिंटरलैंड, अगर दो बन जाए, तो बीच में जो है रिबन बेस्ड डेवलपमेंट होने लगेगी। व्हाट इज रिबन बेस्ड डेवलपमेंट? जैसे एक रोड बन गई या कोई रेलवे लाइन बन गई, उसके दोनों तरफ आप देखोगे इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी शुरू हो जाती है, तो दैट इज रिबन बेस्ड डेवलपमेंट। ठीक है, तो ओवरऑल